we're going to talk about values. This is a segment that we are working on incorporating into the program every month. And last month we talked about integrity. This month we want to talk about the golden rule, which is more or less paraphrased to treat others the way you would like them to treat you. And I'm going to introduce this topic by actually referencing one of my favorite authors, and that would be Jordan Peterson. He was in town recently for his book tour, and I was fortunate enough to attend that event. And one of the things that he talked about during his lecture was the concept of reciprocity. And so what he did is he went to a couple in the audience on the front row, and he said, "Well, we're going to play a thought a, a thought game. We're going to pretend like I'm going to give you $100." He says this to the gentleman. "And you, sir, are going to make an offer to the young lady beside you to give her however much of that $100 you think you want to give her. Well, the caveat is if she doesn't accept your offer, then neither one of you get anything." So he looks at the young man and he says, "Well, how much are you going to give her? How much are you going to offer?" And he says, "Well, $50." Dr. Peterson says, "Well, yes, that's the right answer. But interestingly, there are economic theorists that suggest that you should have only offered her $5. Well, why is that, you might ask? Well, because if you offer her $5, why wouldn't she take it? That's $5 that she doesn't have. And then you get to keep $95. So that works out great for you." Well, the answer is that in real life, what actually happens is that people feel like you're not treating them fairly. And they would rather shove it back in your face than take the $5. Because they get more than $5 of satisfaction knowing that you don't get to keep the 95. Well, where this really becomes interesting is when you apply time over a longer time horizon and you think about the concept of trust. So when you offer someone a fair amount, that builds your trust with that person. And if there's a good chance that you're going to have future interactions with that person, like, for example, if you're married and you're having future interactions with a spouse, you have an incentive to treat that person fairly. The more you treat someone fairly, the more they trust you. Now, here's where that becomes a valuable thing to know. If you and I are having an interaction and you don't trust that I'm going to treat you fairly, then before you accept whatever it is that I'm offering, you're going to do due diligence. You're going to do research. You're going to look into it. You're going to make sure that you're not getting the short end of the stick. Well, that takes time, that takes resources. And so the cost of that transaction is actually relatively high for you. If you trust me, then you don't have to do any of that stuff. You can just take my word for it. And so the cost of that transaction is actually lower. So over time, you have an incentive to treat people fairly, especially if you are going to interact with them on a regular basis, because the more people trust one another, the lower the cost of each transaction and the more efficient the market actually works. So that's very important to know. We've been taught the golden rule our entire lives.
Yep.
And of course, it goes back to biblical times, right? Jesus actually is quoted as saying something very similar in the book of Matthew. Um, but it actually works out very well in the real world that when you treat other people the way you want them to treat you, that actually makes an economy work more smoothly because the cost of engaging in transactions is much lower than it otherwise would be. So that blew me away. That was a brilliant analysis from Dr. Peterson, but it also makes sense. It just validates what we already know from our personal experience to be true. So, what are your thoughts on the golden rule?
Well, I mean, it's the only way to live as far as I'm concerned. I mean, we just need to do the right thing. But let me sidestep just a second because as you were talking, I couldn't help but think, okay, so for our married listeners out there, I want you, if somebody gave you $100 and your wife knew that, and you gave her $5, I want to know what her reaction was to that. Post it on her Facebook or any of her social media because, you know, I'd be very interested to see how that goes afterwards.
Maybe we can craft a Facebook post and do some sort of a feedback discussion feedback request to our listeners because that would be very interesting. What would you do if
Yeah.
your spouse offered you the $5 and kept the 95?
I imagine they would be outside sleeping for one. you
Take
know?
your $95 and buy a tent.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But man, that's I can see it now. But all kidding aside, you know, we just it's easy to get caught up and forget about other people and forget about what it means to do the right thing. And one of the first things that came to my mind when you were talking about that and the higher cost of the transaction and the future cost there, absolutely correct. But what about the fact that you might not even do that future transaction, right? Um, what about what happens down the line when you run into that person that you have these trust issues with and you go, you know what? It's not worth it for me to do that transaction. And so that's a loss for a lot of people, right? Both sides of the equation there. And um, I'm a big believer in what goes around comes around, and you got to treat people the right way. And you don't burn bridges. You never know when you're going to see that person again later on in life. You don't know what circumstance you're going to see them in. You might need their help next time you see them. So you would definitely want to know that you treated them the right way when you had the chance, and hopefully they would, pay it forward back to you at that later time.
I think that's a great point too. I mean, obviously in my analysis, you almost lose a little bit of the personal side of it because it breaks it down. I broke things down into the cost of an economic transaction, but the fact of the matter is that we're not purely driven by economic motives. When you treat someone the right way, you establish a connection with that person at kind of a fundamental relational level. It gives you a chance to build a friendship. It gives you a chance to have a deeper relationship. Obviously, if you don't treat me well and I don't think that you're going to treat me well, I don't really have any reason to think that you and I are going to become friends. I don't have any reason to let my defenses down and be vulnerable. I don't have any reason to share with you, not just physical goods or services, but I don't have any reason to share anything with you. Knowledge, wisdom, expertise, skills, any of that. And so there is so much more to it than just money or stuff. There's a whole deeper level, that goes with the personal side of things. And I think it's important not to lose that. And I'm glad that you brought that back into the equation because, ultimately, what are we about here at the Purposeful Podcast except trying to help people live the most purposeful and
Yeah.
meaningful lives? And people don't get to the end of their lives and think, "Oh, I wish I had more stuff." The regrets that people have are related to the relationships
Yep.
in their lives. I wish that things would have been better with my kids, or I wish that things would have been better with my spouse or my parents, or, I regret that I got divorced, or I regret that this happened or that happened. You want to behave in such a way that you don't have those kinds of regrets. And the fact of the matter is, when you treat someone the way you would want them to treat you, even if they don't treat you the way that you should be treated, you can you can know in your heart that you did what you could to get the best out of that relationship. And then you don't have the regret that comes with knowing that maybe you didn't. And I think that's an important thing as well.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. And, take the high road, live right, do the right thing when nobody's watching, and, try not to judge what somebody else is doing. They've been through their own hardships, spiritually, professionally. And, we all just try to encourage each other to get better every day and use our time wisely that we have.